Welcome to our deep dive into the fascinating world of personality. We're going to be exploring how it develops, how it shapes our behavior, and its connection to well being. And we're not just talking about labels here, right? We're going way deeper. We actually dove into a ton of research, including a textbook on biosocial medicine, to uncover some really surprising insights.
It's going to be a fascinating journey.
Trust me, I'm already intrigued. So, to kick things off, let's think about this. Have you ever wondered how your personality actually takes shape? Like, do we just pop out with a fully formed personality?
That's a great question.
Or is it something that develops over time?
Definitely not something you're born with. It's constantly evolving as we grow and learn, like a dynamic story unfolding.
Okay. So, chapters in a book, each chapter influenced by our experiences and interactions. Fascinating. So, to really understand this evolution, we need to delve into some classic theories. I think it makes sense to start with Sigmund Freud, a name you probably heard before.
Oh, absolutely. His theory of psychosexual development, while maybe a bit outdated now, still highlights some crucial shifts that happen as a child grows.
I know some people find his focus on sexuality a little well intense.
True. But remember, he was trying to understand how unresolved conflicts from childhood could actually contribute to mental health issues in adults. Take, for example, his oral stage.
So when infants find pleasure in sucking and feeding,
Yeah, now, if those needs aren't met appropriately, it can actually have an impact later in life, like in your relationship with food, or even tendencies towards dependency in relationships.
oh, so like a ripple effect from infancy to adulthood. That's pretty insightful.
It's not just about the oral stage, his anal stage, where a child is figuring out control over bodily functions. That can also offer some insights, like think about tendencies towards orderliness or being really rigid, or even those with obsessive compulsive tendencies.
You're saying those patterns can sometimes be traced back to those early struggles with control. Often, though, I have to say, thinking about all this makes me reflect on my own childhood potty training experiences.
We all have those moments.
But it's really interesting to think about how these seemingly simple childhood experiences can leave such a lasting imprint on our personalities. But Freud's theories haven't exactly gone unchallenged.
Oh, definitely not. There have been a lot of criticisms over time for a number of reasons. Some people take issue with his focus on male development, for example, and there's a lack of scientific evidence to support some of his claims. But his theories, despite the flaws, really did lay the groundwork for other psychologists to explore personality development in new ways.
That brings us to Erik Erikson, who expanded on Freud's ideas with his psychosocial stages of development.
Erikson is really interesting. What sets him apart is his emphasis on the social and cultural context of a child's upbringing.
So, not just the individual, but also their environment.
Exactly. He believed that at each stage of life, we face a specific conflict that needs to be resolved in order to develop a healthy personality. It's like navigating a series of hurdles.
I like that analogy. So, we're jumping over hurdles, and each one represents a challenge. And if we overcome it, we gain a particular strength. Okay, so walk me through some of these stages. What are some of the challenges, and how do they shape us?
Well, in the very first stage, it's all about trust versus mistrust.
Oh, so like babies learning to trust their caregivers.
Precisely, infants need to develop that basic trust that their needs will be met, that the world is a safe place. If they do, they develop a sense of hope and security.
And if not,
Well, if that trust isn't established, it can lead to anxieties and difficulties forming healthy relationships later on.
that makes perfect sense. And what about later stages? I'm especially curious about the adolescent years, when many of us were trying to figure out our place in the world.
Erickson called that stage identity versus role confusion.
Oh, I remember that one.
Think back to your teenage years.
Yeah, I think I'd rather not have, but I get your point.
That feeling of trying to figure out who you are, what you believe in, where you fit in.
Oh, yeah. Definitely had that.
That's the essence of this stage, and it can have a huge impact on our sense of self and our direction in life.
It's incredible how these stages resonate with our own experiences, isn't it?
It really is. And it doesn't stop there. As we move through adulthood, we face new challenges, like forming intimate relationships, finding a sense of purpose in our work and family life, and ultimately reflecting on our lives with a sense of integrity.
He even proposed a ninth stage, right facing mortality.
He did, and he actually explored that stage with his wife, Joan, in their 90s.
Well, it's a powerful reminder that personality development is a lifelong journey.
Absolutely, with new challenges and opportunities for growth at every stage.
Speaking of growth, I think it's time we move on to how we actually describe personality in adults. It's one thing to talk about development, but how do we categorize those complex inner workings?
Yeah, how do we actually put it into words? Good question.
So we've talked about how personality develops from those early stages. But now let's dive into how we actually measure and describe personality in adults. Like, how do we capture all those nuances?
Well, a really common way is through what's known as the Big Five personality traits. You've probably heard of them.
Yeah, I definitely have. But I've always wondered, like, where do these big five come from?
Oh, it's not random at all. They emerged from what's called the lexical hypothesis.
Lexical hypothesis.
Basically, it means analyzing all the words, the thousands of words that we use to describe personality,
So researchers are basically conducting investigations of their own.
exactly into the dictionary, you could say. And what they found is that these five categories consistently emerged as the most fundamental dimensions of personality. So you have extroversion, agreeableness, conscientiousness, neuroticism, and openness to experience.
So it's not like someone just randomly picked five traits out of a hat.
Not at all. They were derived from, well, how we naturally talk about people.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense. And so from there, psychologists developed specific tools to measure these traits.
Yeah, exactly like personality tests. You've probably heard of some of them, the NEO personality inventory, for example, or the Big Five inventory.
I've definitely seen those floating around online.
They basically use questionnaires to pinpoint where individuals fall on each of the five dimensions.
So, like, they might ask me to rate how much I agree with a statement, like I enjoy being the center of attention, which would tell them something about my level of extroversion.
Precisely. Or they might ask about your organizational skills or how easily you get stressed to measure conscientiousness and neuroticism.
Now, here's a question that's always kind of intrigued me. We've been talking about how culture shapes personality, right? So, are these big five traits universal across different cultures, or are they specific to like certain parts of the world?
It's a great question, and the answer is pretty surprising. Research has actually found that the Big Five structure is pretty consistent across many different cultures and languages.
So, despite all the cultural differences out there, there seem to be some fundamental aspects of personality that kind of transcend those boundaries.
That's what the research suggests. Yeah, of course, there's always debate, and some researchers argue that maybe the model doesn't capture everything. Maybe there are additional traits that are relevant in non-Western cultures, for example. But the fact that the Big Five have been found to be so widely applicable is, well, it's pretty remarkable.
It's really interesting. I guess it makes sense to, keep refining our understanding as we learn more. But speaking of these traits and their influence, remember that study I mentioned about childhood personality traits and adult health outcomes?
Oh, yeah, the one in Hawaii where teachers were evaluating kids' personalities back in the 60s?
Exactly.
Okay, remind me what they found.
Okay. So years later, these same individuals were tracked down as adults. And well, researchers looked at their health behaviors, the whole picture, and what they found was, well, pretty remarkable. Actually, there was a link between certain personality traits and those adult health outcomes, really.
So, like, what specifically?
For example, children who were rated as highly conscientious by their teachers, they were less likely to smoke as adults, and in general, reported better overall health.
Hmm, that is interesting. It really suggests that these early personality traits can, like, have this lasting impact.
And it wasn't just conscientiousness either. Kids who were rated as more agreeable, they were less likely to smoke as well, and also had lower rates of obesity in adulthood. So basically, being responsible, organized, friendly, all those things early on.
It kind of sets you on a path toward healthier choices later in life.
Yeah, exactly. It's pretty amazing.
But how do researchers explain that link? Like, is it the personality itself that's having a direct influence, or are there other factors at play?
They found that part of the effect can be explained by education level. So kids who are more conscientious and agreeable, they tended to achieve higher levels of education. And as we know, it's associated with healthier behaviors and and better health outcomes overall.
Because higher education usually leads to better jobs, greater access to healthcare, just more knowledge about health in general.
But here's the interesting part. Even after accounting for education, there's still a direct link between personality and health. Like those early traits, they kind of set you on a certain trajectory.
Even if you face challenges along the way.
So it really underscores that personality isn't just some superficial label.
It has real consequences for our lives, even our physical well-being.
But while the Big Five provides this valuable framework, some psychologists have also explored alternative personality scales that kind of go beyond those five dimensions.
Oh, I'm intrigued. What are some of those, and what kind of new insights do they offer?
Well, let's start with Angela Duckworth's concept of grit, which has gotten a lot of attention lately.
Grit. It's all about perseverance, that passion for long-term goals, those people who just keep pushing through challenges and achieving amazing things.
Exactly. Duckworth argues that grit, especially when you combine it with intelligence, is a huge predictor of achievement. Think about Olympic athletes or successful entrepreneurs, anyone who's accomplished something truly extraordinary.
They're often described as having like exceptional amounts of grit.
But how does grit differ from conscientiousness, though? They seem to have some overlap.
Yeah, they do. They both involve, being dedicated and hardworking.
While they share some similarities, grit is really more focused on the long game, that ability to stick to your goals, even when there aren't immediate rewards. Whereas conscientiousness is more about like organized, responsible, efficient in the here and now.
So you could be very conscientious in your daily life, but lack the grit to pursue a long-term dream that requires years of just dedicated effort.
Yeah, precisely. Grit is about like having that fire in your belly, that unwavering commitment to something that might take years, even decades to achieve. It's about not giving up when things get tough.
It's amazing how these subtle distinctions in personality can really shape our paths, like have such a significant impact.
And speaking of achieving goals, I think it's time we shift gears and talk about another crucial concept: self-efficacy. This one comes from Albert Bandura.
Self-efficacy. It's all about believing in your own ability to succeed, that I can do this attitude.
And the newest research showed that this sense of self-efficacy, it's not something we're just born with, it develops through experiences. You know,
So like practice makes perfect.
I'm not exactly perfect. But yeah, the more we experience success, the more confident we become in our abilities. And actually, Bandura proposed four key mechanisms that contribute to developing self-efficacy.
Oh, interesting. Okay, break those down for me.
Okay, so the first is what he called performance accomplishments, basically experiencing success. When we try something and we succeed, it reinforces that belief in our own capabilities.
It's like building a track record of wins.
Each success, no matter how small, it strengthens that belief.
I like that. What about the other ones?
Okay, so the second is vicarious experiences. That's about seeing other people succeed. So, when we observe someone else accomplishing something we aspire to, it can inspire us, make us think, hey, maybe I can do that too.
The power of role models.
Exactly. And then the third is verbal persuasion, which is basically encouragement from others. When people believe in us and express confidence in our abilities, it can have a huge impact on our self-belief.
I can definitely see that. I mean, think about all the teachers, coaches, mentors who saw something in us and encouraged us to keep going.
It really can make all the difference. And lastly, there's emotional arousal. And this one's interesting because our emotions can either support or undermine our self-efficacy. If we're feeling anxious or fearful, it can kind of chip away at our confidence. But if we're feeling excited and optimistic, it can really boost that belief in ourselves.
So it's like a complex feedback loop between our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors.
Yeah, exactly. And of all these mechanisms, Bandura highlighted inactive mastery experience, which is like actually experiencing success firsthand as the most powerful.
Well, that makes sense. It's one thing to hear that you can do something or even to see someone else do it, but it's a whole other thing to actually experience that success yourself.
And the role of self-efficacy is super crucial in education too. Students who believe in their ability to learn are more likely to embrace challenges, to persevere when things get tough, and ultimately achieve their goals
They're not afraid to make mistakes.
because they see setbacks as opportunities for growth.
And on the flip side, low self-efficacy, it can create a vicious cycle, especially for students from disadvantaged backgrounds.
Bandura's research showed that when students doubt their abilities, they're more likely to give up when they face difficulties, which of course leads to lower performance and then even less motivation. So it just spirals downward.
It really highlights how important it is to nurture that sense of self-belief in all students.
No matter their background. Because those early experiences of success, encouragement, positive emotional arousal, it all really can have a lasting impact on a child's educational journey. So we've covered a lot of ground here, from the big five to grit and self-efficacy. It's really amazing how these frameworks offer a glimpse into the intricacies of personality and how it influences our behavior.
And it's just the tip of the iceberg.
And as we head into the next part of our podcast, we're going to explore how this understanding of personality can actually help us shed light on the complexities of mental illness.
It'll be interesting.
It's a reminder that while we celebrate all the wonderful diversity and resilience of human personality, we also need to understand and address those challenges that arise, when things go wrong. Okay, so we've really explored how personality develops across the lifespan and all these different ways we can understand and measure it. But now I think it's time to shift our focus to a more challenging but equally important topic.
Illness?
Yeah, mental illness, if personality is this complex tapestry woven from, our genes and our experiences.
What happens when things go wrong? When the threads get tangled?
What leads to those struggles with mental well-being? Because it's something that so many people face.
It's a huge topic. And honestly, our understanding of mental illness has evolved a lot over time.
Like, think about some of those old terms like psychosis and neurosis.
Yeah, those broad categories were used for a long time, but they've kind of given way to a more nuanced and specific system of classification.
And now we have the DSM-5, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which outlines all sorts of different conditions.
Anxiety, depression, schizophrenia, personality disorders, The list goes on.
It really does, and it's easy to get lost in the details with all these categories. So what's the core question we're grappling with here?
I think the fundamental question is, what are the root causes of mental illness? Like, is it mainly a result of disruptive social experiences, especially in childhood? Or is it more about, inherited genetic abnormalities?
It's that nature versus nurture debate again. And when it comes to mental illness, the answer is probably not so clear-cut.
Rarely is.
So how does what we've learned about personality development actually help us understand this?
Well, knowing how personality unfolds can definitely offer some clues. Let's take, for example, Huntington's disease. That's a neurocognitive disorder with a very clear genetic basis.
So genes play a major role in that one.
They do. There's a specific gene mutation that basically disrupts brain function, leading to a whole bunch of symptoms like moving disorders, cognitive decline, and even psychiatric problems.
So in that case, nature's influence is pretty clear. But what about like disorders that seem more rooted in experience, like post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD?
PTSD is a perfect example of how traumatic events, especially those that happen in childhood, can have this really lasting impact on mental health.
Because like exposure to violence, abuse, neglect, all of those things can really disrupt normal emotional and psychological development.
Exactly. And that can increase the risk of PTSD later on.
It's a reminder of how vulnerable we are, especially during those early years.
Absolutely. And while some disorders have really clear origins, like it's either genetic or environmental, many fall somewhere in between. Schizophrenia, for example, or bipolar disorder or major depressive disorder, recent research has actually found that there are shared genetic risk factors for these conditions.
So it's not just the genes themselves, but how they interact with our life experiences.
Yeah, it's like you might inherit a predisposition, but it's the interplay with your environment that determines whether those genes are actually switched on.
And that's where those early childhood experiences become so important. And it makes me think back to attachment theory, John Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, right? They emphasized how crucial that early bond with a primary caregiver is.
It's all about that sense of security, right? Our ability to trust others, to regulate our own emotions.
And if those early bonds are disrupted, well, it can have these cascading effects on development.
Bowlby actually quite emphatic about that. He said that disturbed family relationships commonly loom large in the development of mental health issues.
It really highlights why it's so important to understand nature and nurture. When it comes to mental illness, it's not about placing blame, but just, recognizing that it's this complex web of factors that contributes to these conditions.
It's about understanding the whole person.
And while we've just scratched the surface of this really complex topic, it's clear that personality development provides us with this really valuable lens for understanding the challenges of mental health.
I think so too.
And as we wrap up our podcast today, I want to leave you with this thought. If personality is something that's shaped by experience, what steps can you take, maybe even today, to cultivate the traits you want to embody? How could you, use that power of self-efficacy to achieve your goals? And how can we all work to support the well-being of ourselves and those around us?
It's a lifelong journey, that's for sure.
It really is, but it's a journey worth taking. So keep exploring. Keep learning of the fascinating world of personality. Thanks for joining us today. Bye.